Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for your time and joining us this afternoon. My name is Jennifer Jun. I represent an organization called SIWI, the Stockholm International Water Institute. We are so pleased that you could join us. First, I'm sorry? Oh, sure. Can you hear me better? Great. I will try my best to speak as loud as possible. I am actually here to replace my colleague Maggie White. Maggie is the Senior Program Manager for International Policy at SIWI. She fell ill this morning with a fever, so I had to stand in sort of as a last-minute alternate. So for that reason, I ask for your understanding and forgiveness that I will rely a little bit more on my written notes than is probably ideal. First and foremost, I wanted to thank our partners in convening this seminar, ABF, FUF, and Diakonia. I would also like to thank our co-panelists today, Anna Axelsson and Karin Lexén, for agreeing to speak on a topic that we believe is very important and timely. Just to run through the order of business today, so we will first start with kind of a scene setter from our side, from SIWI's perspective, on water and the two global agendas. And then we will continue with a presentation by Anna, then followed by a presentation by Karin. And after that, we will have a panel discussion among the three of us. Hopefully it's a dynamic, kind of casual discussion. During that time, of course, feel free to think about questions you'd like to ask us, and then we can open it up for a Q&A towards the end. And when you do ask your questions, we will be circulating a microphone so that we catch it for the live streaming that we are conducting at the moment. So this conversation is being streamed, but don't be shy. And that's it for the order of business today. So I will begin with the presentation from SIWI. Let me just move the microphone this way. Okay. So some of you might be familiar with SIWI. For others of you, it might be a brand new organization. We are based in Stockholm. We are an international water institute. We leverage knowledge and our convening power to strengthen water governance for a just, prosperous, and sustainable future. You might have heard of something called the Stockholm Water Festival. It was happening in the early 90s. That is very much our founding story in 1991. Kind of at the intersection of the Stockholm Water Festival, the Stockholm Water Symposium, and the Stockholm Water Prize. That is where SIWI was founded. We are an independent foundation. It's a nonprofit. We try to remain neutral. Just to go a little bit further into kind of the meat of our work, we conduct research, facilitate international water projects, and provide platforms for collaboration to develop expertise on water-related issues, particularly in the areas of transboundary water management and water governance. Our vision, as you can see on the slide, is a water-wise world. That means for us, a world that recognizes the value of water and ensures that it is inclusively shared and used sustainably, equitably, and efficiently for all. Our mission towards that vision is to strengthen water governance for a just, prosperous, and sustainable future. I would just add that given our vision and mission, it is very important for us to work on three what we call cross-cutting foci or issues. So the first is a human rights-based approach on water governance. The second is gender equity, and the third is the inclusion of youth voices in all of the work that we do. As mentioned, we had our founding with a public festival that we were very well known for called the Stockholm Water Festival, and that has evolved into something that we call the World Water Week. It happens every August in Stockholm. It is the leading annual event in the world on global water and development issues. We also, as an example of our work, have something called the Water Governance Facility, where we collaborate between the UNDP, WGF, to improve how water resources are governed globally. As an example of what the team that I work as part of, the Swedish Water House, what we do, we have something called the Swedish Textile Water Initiative, which is a collaboration with Swedish textile companies to engage suppliers to improve water, energy, and chemicals management in the textile production, using water as an entry point. You might have also heard of SIWI's work as a UNESCO Category 2 center, as the host of a center called the International Center for Water Cooperation. It is the first ever center in the world to focus on transboundary water management in connection with peace, conflict, and regional development. Also at World Water Week, we host something called the Stockholm Water Prize. Together with that, a Stockholm Junior Water Prize that is organized under the patronage of the King of Sweden. As mentioned, I work as part of a team at SIWI called the Swedish Water House. We act as an impartial platform for Swedish actors interested in international water issues, creating spaces for dialogue, cooperation, and knowledge sharing. The overall objective of the Swedish Water House is to contribute to cooperation over water and development issues. An important element of Swedish Water House activity consists of seminars and workshops. Just like this one, we have a seminar every month, and this is our way to engage with you, engage with the public, engage with various civil society organizations around the issues that are important for us, and to also raise awareness on water as a global issue. As the last sentence says, I think we recognize that water is often invisible in the public sphere, and so that's where we like to, we value our contribution to raising awareness about the importance of water. Now on to the main kind of point of this seminar. We are here to talk about the 2 global agendas. Just a little bit of background on why SIWI, why Swedish Water House, why are we involved in the global agendas to begin with. I would imagine that many of you here in the room have a basic to very sophisticated understanding of the SDGs, the 2030 Global Agenda. As you know, this is a historic milestone. It's a historic agreement by countries as part of the UN system to agree on a set of principles, a set of ambitions around 17 very important issues that form something called the Sustainable Development Goals. The overall aim of the SDGs is to stand as a call to action for ending poverty, protecting the planet, and ensuring that all people enjoy peace and prosperity. For us at SIWI and the Swedish Water House, because this is a very important historic global achievement already in setting this in motion, we want to make sure that our work on water and water governance is closely following, is engaged, is contributing to this important effort. Also, the same year that the global agenda came, the Sustainable Development Goals came together in 2015, we saw the establishment of the Paris Agreement. That is kind of a parallel process with the UNFCCC in getting countries to commit to and submit something called the National Development Contribution, something that Anna will speak a little bit more about later in her presentation. And that is an equally ambitious effort by countries to commit to lowering the temperature by 1.5 degrees, which would require enormous efforts to reduce our emissions. As you know, one of the SDGs is SDG 6 on water, and for us, it was a very important accomplishment that we could get water in as a standalone sustainable development goal in the UN agenda. However, we at SIWI like to believe that water is something that can actually tie all of the SDGs together, not just stand by itself as its own sector, but something that can enable for all of the SDGs to be met in a efficient, holistic, complementary way. And so for us, just to expand upon that, we consider water as the backbone to reaching the global agendas. And just to expand on that further, for us, wise water governance means that we can build a resilient future through water. We can identify adaptation and mitigation solutions through water. We can also apply a cost-efficient way to deliver on multi-services. Water can be used in the context of water diplomacy to create dialogue and trust among countries that are in conflict over water. Water can also further social and environmental justice. Water can deliver on climate security. Water is, for us, a local solution. It has the capacity of delivering local solutions on global issues. This graph here, it's a bit fuzzy, but this for us is kind of the ultimate legend or key for thinking about how water does connect to every single SDG. I don't think there's a way to expand the text, unfortunately, but I'm more than happy to share this with you after the presentation. Just to take one example, just to illustrate the interlinkages between water and some of the other SDGs, SDG 10 on the alleviation of poverty, as an example, 2/3 of the world population today is estimated to live under conditions where water is scarce for at least 1 month out of the year. As you can imagine, climate change is going to exacerbate that even more. And it's going to exacerbate that for populations that are traditionally left behind, disadvantaged groups such as rural households, rural farmers that are engaged in agricultural practices. And so for us, equitable access to water is something that can make the difference between a family that is farming as merely a means of survival and elevating that to a level where they can see farming as a reliable source for their livelihood. While smallholder farmers constitute the backbone of national food supplies, contributing to more than half of the agricultural production in many countries, they themselves often suffer from food insecurity and malnutrition. So I just wanted to include that as an example, as a concrete example of how water can directly tie with alleviating poverty. And again, this chart shows various examples of kind of the crucial place water has in the SDG agenda. Very quickly, as a last set of remarks, water and the Paris Agreement. As you can also imagine, water is something that is closely linked to climate because 90% of climate manifestations, changes in the climate, the impacts of climate change are experienced through water in the form of droughts, floods, storms, hurricanes, sea level rise, tsunamis. Water does not explicitly appear in the Paris Agreement, but it is very much assumed to be a cornerstone for both on the mitigation, so lowering greenhouse gases, and adaptation, how we change our behavior to adapt to a changing climate. Something that I mentioned earlier, which Anna can also expand upon, something called the nationally developed contributions. We see many NDCs prioritizing water, including water in their submissions. So clearly countries are also realizing that water is very crucial for them to meet both the mitigation and adaptation goals. That is it for my portion of the presentation, and I will now invite Anna to speak, and I will also invite her to introduce herself. Thank you.
Thank you. Is my presentation on here as well?
I think you have to go to the right one. Is that yours? Great.
That's it. Perfect. Thank you for the invitation. My name is Anna Axelsson. I work at Diakonia as a policy advisor on climate change. And Diakonia is a development organization, a Swedish organization with offices in 23 countries, where we support local civil society to work on such things as democracy, human rights, sustainable livelihoods, and peace and justice. And we work then on climate policy from our head office here in Stockholm, because climate change is an issue that impacts on all those people that we are working with, people who live in poverty and who are more or less marginalized in their respective societies. And they're usually the people who are hit first and hit the hardest by changes in climate. So I've said that I'm going to talk about compatibility, risks and opportunities involved with linking Agenda 2030 and the Paris Agreement. I should say first, I think that having these two agreements that you've also just talked about, that were both adopted in 2015, is an... am I speaking? Or do you hear me, by the way? Because I'm not... You don't hear me?
Yeah.
You do? Okay. I will move this anyway. That might be better. And I'm okay for this one? Yeah, okay.
You can move that one to the other side as well if it fits.
No, it doesn't. No.
Okay.
Okay. I'll stand in the middle between the two microphones then. Yes, we do have an unprecedented opportunity in having these two global frameworks. It's a feat, I would say, by the governments of the world to be able to agree on quite far-reaching agendas. Although there's much left to be had from such agreements, they could certainly be a lot stronger, a lot better. It is still a feat that basically all countries have agreed to set up 17 goals on how to reach sustainable development and on how to combat climate change. It shows that there is a commitment to sustainable development, and one thing that is certainly clear is that climate action is necessary and a prerequisite for reaching also the sustainable development goals. The IPCC, which is the UN's intergovernmental panel on climate change that summarizes and presents science on climate change, they confirmed last year that achieving the SDGs will be easier if we also manage to limit climate change to a warming of 1.5 degrees. So there are many reasons to link these agendas, and that also means, of course, that the agreements should be compatible. The Paris Agreement, for example, states that the actions under it should be implemented in the context of sustainable development and with efforts to eradicate poverty. But the Agenda 2030, I would say, is a much broader and much more comprehensive set of goals defining what is actually sustainable development. So it's more clear in that way what kind of state of development you actually want to achieve. The Paris Agreement is more vague in terms of its objectives. You could say that the objectives of the Paris Agreements are three, where one is to make efforts to limit warming to a maximum of 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, with efforts also to manage to keep it under 1.5. Secondly, it's also the objective is to increase the ability to adapt to the changes that are coming, no matter how much the temperature is going to increase, there will be changes that we need to adapt to, and to increase the capacity for resilience. And it also sets out to ensure that financial flows in the world are consistent with low development. Not low development. Low emissions development. So consistent with low emissions. So I will talk a bit more about the Paris Agreement. Like you said, this is what I have worked more on, and I think that you have already presented the Agenda 2030 really well. The Paris Agreement is binding as such for countries that have signed on to it, but much of the action under the agreement is actually not binding. So for example, one of the means that are used in the Paris Agreement to ensure that we can manage to limit global warming is that all countries need to have their own national plans for climate action, the nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. And it is binding, it is mandatory to have such a plan and to update it regularly, and then to increase ambition. But it is not mandatory to implement what you write in your plan. So that means that, we can't really be sure what is actually going to be undertaken, even though we have the Paris Agreement. And last year, countries adopted what is popularly called the Paris Agreement Rulebook, the set of rules and guidelines that will guide the implementation, how you present your action, how you present what you have done, what you're planning to do, the money spent, etc. And again, it's a feat to manage to agree on such a rule book, but it does leave a lot of room for interpretation. It has a lot of language, like parties or countries are invited to do in a certain way, or they are advised to report in a certain way as appropriate in their particular context. And that means there's a lot of space for countries to actually do a little bit as they please. The rules depicted in this rule book also for finance, climate finance from richer countries to poorer countries. They open up for including loans and guarantees and private finance in the sums reported as climate finance. And while it's good that more money is flowing for purposes of adapting to climate change and reducing emissions, there's also a risk that poorer countries build up more debt because they try to face or to take climate action, and there will also be a lot of money flowing back as they pay back those loans. And in the Paris Agreement, language on human rights is only present in the preface to the agreement, so there are no binding commitments on human rights or gender, participation or indigenous people's rights, etc. It is mentioned as a sort of general idea that you need to adhere to. But I think this is where, thank you. This is where the SDG framework really provides some backbone, some content to what kind of development that the Paris Agreement should also support. I think that without the Paris Agreement, without Agenda 2030, would risk to be very technical and only have a focus on technical solutions for reducing emissions and for adapting to climate change, and it would have there would be a risk that you sort of lose the human face of the transition that needs to take place, because it doesn't have those concrete places where you ensure that you consider human rights and gender rights, etc. Then on the other hand, having the Agenda 2030 without the Paris Agreement means that we would have much less to guide us on climate action, because the SDG agenda was adopted before the Paris Agreement. So goal 13 on climate was intentionally left quite vague, because they couldn't preempt what was coming out of the other negotiations. So that was left quite open. So in that sense, you see that these agendas are very compatible, and there are a lot of opportunities, I think, in linking these agendas. Now, both of these frameworks are to be implemented at the national level. I mean, they're formulated, they're ready, the rules are ready, the frameworks we're following up are also ready, which means that it's now up to national governments and civil society and other actors in each country to ensure that we work to reach the goals. And that means, of course, that depending on, for example, government setup, we could still have a context where we work in silos and work on climate action in one department and on following up the SDGs in another. And therefore, the coordination between different actors in government, for example, is very important in order to link these agendas in practice. In order to look a little bit deeper into the linkages, I wanted to show you a picture from the IPCC report from last year. They did a special report on the effects of 1.5 degrees warming compared to 2 degrees warming. And in chapter 5 of that report, they look at how climate action relates to sustainable development. And they identify a lot of synergies, but also some trade-offs. And it looks like this. And basically, what this tells us is there are more synergies than there are trade-offs between climate action and sustainable development. I'm not saying Paris Agreement now, because this is really climate action. And what they've listed is synergies and trade-offs related to 3 areas, where energy supply, which you see at the left here, is about producing biomass for energy, building and expanding renewable energy, nuclear power, carbon capture and storage, and similar things. And as you can see, there are many synergies, but also a few areas where there could be trade-offs. And the length of the bar here represents sort of how strong the linkage is. So the longer the bar, the stronger the linkage. And the darker the color of the bar, the higher the confidence in these findings. So you see, for example, that there could be trade-offs between shifting to fossil-free energy with the water goal, for example. That, of course, doesn't mean that we shouldn't shift to renewable, sustainable energy. It just means that there are risks that need to be paid attention to and managed in order to respect human rights, etc., and environmental integrity and other things. In the middle is energy demand, and those are measures or options such as shifting behaviors, switching fuels, and working with energy efficiency in transport, industry, and building sectors. And then at the far right, it says land, and that includes a lot of different actions, such as switching to sustainable diets, reducing food waste, increasing carbon sequestration in soils, livestock management, reducing deforestation and reforestation, etc. And as you can see, there are a lot of synergies with the SDGs, but a few areas where you need to pay attention to risk as well. And also here, the highest trade-off is identified with the goal on water. And yeah, I will not go into more detail. We can do that in the discussion because my time is up. But overall, I think this shows that the 2 agendas, working on climate action and sustainable development, they are compatible and they are mutually supportive. And there are risks, but it doesn't mean that we need to go slow on climate action. On the contrary, more climate action will mean that we easier can reach the SDGs. And what this figure also doesn't include are the benefits achieved with actually reducing emissions. So, in essence, this means that being aware of risks and ensuring that there are safeguards and ways to address them. And I think I will leave it there and we can continue in the discussion. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Should be the next slide.
So it looks like a small press conference here. Can we get rid of this?
No.
You can't?
We need it for the streaming online.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
So it is a small press conference. So, and I'm also pretty short, but let's try. So hello everybody, I'm Karin Lexén. I'm currently the Secretary General of the Swedish Society for Nature Conservation, in Swedish, Naturskyddsföreningen. That is the, and you cannot hear me, I can see. So I think this one is host. Sorry about this. So if we this is really interesting.
Yeah, because this is fixed.
Is it better now? Yeah. Yeah. But you could hear what I said a little bit. No, you couldn't. Can I get another minute for restarting? So I'm Karin Lexén. I'm currently the Secretary General of the Swedish Society for Nature Conservation. In Swedish, that is Naturskyddsföreningen. This is the largest environmental NGO with 231,000 members in 270 local groups across Sweden. We've been existing since 1909, so we're pretty old. Before I came into office in this position, I worked for SIWI for 10 years. So it's nice to be back and to hear about the descriptions that I've also been part of for quite some time. I think I was asked to speak a little bit to the issue of the European Union. I refer back to what we have been doing when it comes to following the elections. We have had a campaign on the elections to try to bring up the issues on the environmental issues. And I'll try to do a mix in 12 minutes, so speak a little bit about what we think is the most important to follow when it comes to the EU. And then towards the end, I will also tell you a little bit about our findings. So I give it a try. Anna was speaking to, and both of you were speaking to the importance of linking climate change and the Agenda 2030 agenda. And I'd like to bring the other cousin or the sister of the Climate Convention on the table. So in the first Rio conference of 1992, there were two conventions initiated and later on established. And that was the Climate Convention, but also the Convention on Biodiversity. And it's very obvious currently that climate change is almost an existential threat, but also the threat from biodiversity loss. And it's become more and more clear that we have to address both these challenges, and we do have to do it so that we do it in an interactive way. They are interlinked, and if you don't address biodiversity loss while addressing climate change, you will really turn up into a mess. and you will not be able to save climate change either. And I think it was interesting to see, Anna, in your picture. I was looking at goal number 15, and it was very evident, both with sort of risks and the synergies that you can find. So I think when it comes to biodiversity and climate change, we do have a challenge to be able to both reduce the emissions of climate change gases, but we also, and at the same time, secure biodiversity. But we believe it's important, and we think that this is also very important when it comes to EU policy. And the report that you referred to earlier, Anna, the IPCC report of the last year, very clearly said that it's important, it's of utmost importance that the synergies between the climate change and biodiversity agendas are made explicit and are addressed, and also linked to the SDGs. And the report says that effective measurements to conserve land stocks, to steer towards sustainable agriculture, and to recover healthy fresh water and marine ecosystems are key in all mitigation efforts to achieve the 1.5 target. So if you don't do that, you will miss the opportunity also to secure a safe path towards the 1.5 target degree. In all this, fresh water is fundamental. It's really part of what we always have been saying when I was part of SIWI, to say that you need to address water issues when you address the climate issue. And biodiversity just adds on that message, that the biodiversity is essential also for securing fresh water. And in doing all this, of course, as the other report, the UN report that came out a month ago, that is the report IPES, and if you are to tell the full name, Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. This report came out a month ago, and it says that 1 million species are threatened to disappear. And they say that this threat, and this is also the unit says that this threat is as tough and as dangerous to mankind as the threat of climate change. So we need to address both. When it comes to EU, the European Union, and what we think is important to right now, a lot of things that needs to be decided upon. And referring to the Paris Agreement, of course the EU plays a very important role. It doesn't look very good if you look out the global landscape right now, with the different countries like the US, Russia or China. So EU does play a very important role, and the EU has to come out strong in the negotiations, but it also has to show by example. And so one of the important issues that we are tracking very closely is the debate and the work on the emission target for 2030. We think that it needs to be much stronger than what it is today. The EU has a decision on 40% reduction. We think it needs to come down to about 70%. And the reason is that globally it needs to be reduced by around 50%, the IPCC says. And we think that EU, given that we are part of the welfare part of the world, but also because we have a lot of technique and a lot of possibilities, we do need to lead by example and show that it's possible to reduce. The IPCC report says that we have about 11 years now, up until 2030, to really change the emission pattern that we have now. We have to curb the emissions And we believe that EU has to take the lead in this. We can't see any other possibilities than EU taking the lead. And that, of course, also means that we have to have stronger goals on renewables and on energy efficiency within the EU. We also think that we have to focus much more on climate smart transports, trains. There are a lot of discussions on how to make it possible to travel smoothly on train again throughout Europe. It was much easier 30 years ago when I was young and did Interrail than what it is today, and that is really strange. So that is one example. And then we have to get rid of subsidies that are subsidizing fossil fuels, and we do have to get rid of the coals. I think it was said that one reason why the EU couldn't come further on its targets is that even Germany, that used to be a progressive force, is very dependent still on its fossil fuels and also on coal. And it was a little bit strange to have the last COP, the Conference of the Parties in Poland, in Katowice, surrounded by coal plants, and really knowing that Poland is extremely dependent on carbon and on coal for its energy supply. Now when it comes to biodiversity, as I said, this is as important as climate change, and the EU is working on a new strategy on biodiversity. It's very clear that the strategy that was decided upon in 2011 is far from being met, as it is very far from that the targets of the Convention on Biodiversity is going to be met. There are targets called the ACHI targets towards 2020, and they are certainly not going to be met either. And interestingly enough, the EU is now working on biodiversity strategy to be decided upon in 2021, and next year is going to be a really important conference of the parties of the Convention of Biodiversity. And so the EU is working now on its position towards the convention, but also convention meeting, but also towards its strategy meeting. And in this, coming back to freshwater, the collapse in freshwater biodiversity is one of the strongest problems when it comes to biodiversity. I can mention a few things. Think about wetlands, think about rivers, think about flood plants and peatlands. In Swedish, peatlands is våtmarker, I think. And these are extremely important when it comes to store carbon. So peatlands are indeed extremely important when it comes to create resilience and to adapt to climate change. The freshwater species are declining at a faster rate than species in any other ecosystems. For example, the abundance of populations modified in the freshwater system in Europe declined by 83% in the last decades. And not even half of the freshwater in Europe is considered healthy. So when it comes to biodiversity then, biodiversity strategy, CAP stands for Common Agriculture Policy. The agricultural problems in Europe are vast. There's negotiations on the new CAP, and it's fundamental that this is steering towards sustainability when it comes to both climate change and biodiversity. There is something called a Framework Directive on Water. It needs to be maintained, it needs to be strengthened. We are far from achieving the targets also here in Sweden. That's something we need to work on, and we need to work on sustainable fishing. Now, in our campaign, we did, you cannot see this, but anyway, what we did, just 1 minute of explanation. We, my organization has for a long time been doing, what is undersökningar? Sorry. Surveys, yeah. it's a long time since I worked in English, so I'm a little bit accustomed to that. But we did a survey on what the Swedish parliamentarians did during the last term, and we also had another survey on what we wanted to do in the new term. And these are 18 questions that we posed to the parties that were sort of preparing for elections towards the new term of the EU Parliament. And up in the upper part you can see it's the different letters of the parties. And we have then raised issues around climate, biodiversity, around environmental pollutants. And the Greens means that they agree, and red, of course, that they disagree. And it looks pretty good. But we can say that the results from how our parliamentarians did vote during the last term doesn't really concur with what they are saying that they are going to do next time. So we are going to follow this closely. I have two issues just as an example of on the report on the table. They are unfortunately only in Swedish, but you can get them on the website too. And it might be interesting for you to read about what they did and also what they promised. And just to try to wrap up then, the EU work is going to be very, very important also when it comes to the global agenda. Sweden has taken on a kind of a leadership role. Sometimes it's interesting that the government's positions are being watered down in the Swedish Parliament because they have to seek support from all the parties before negotiating in the EU. So we can see that, for instance, of course, the Sverigedemokraterna, whatever they are called in English, but also the Conservatives and the Christian Democrats are often sort of lowering the ambitions that Sweden would go to in the negotiations. But still, Sweden is at the front, could perform better, we think. What is interesting now is that in Finland they got a new government that did yesterday agree upon a very progressive environmental agenda with a stronger climate goal than Sweden. And also in Denmark there is a shift, so maybe the Nordic countries could take on a stronger role to push the EU to become a little bit more radical. That is our hope, at least. So this was really a broad brush, many different issues to cover, but that's the beginning, perhaps, of a conversation.
Great, thank you. All right. So, to kick off the panel discussion, I wanted to ask both of you, it seems as though we do have sufficient number of agendas, commitments, plans, rule books, and so on. How do we translate all of that has been set up and achieved into action? And you can be as specific as you would like to be with examples from within Sweden or cite examples at a regional level. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on how the most important question of all, how we translate all of this into concrete action.
You want to go first, Summer?
Okay. Yeah, you're right. This is it's really like a press conference. I said it was just like a press conference, but obviously I also need to raise my voice a little bit. Is it better? Yes. Thank you for shouting out and warning. How do we turn it into action? Yes, that is the big question, I think, and I think there are many different things that need to be done. One thing I mentioned was the need for coordination within government to set the frameworks for how we work at national level. I think there is, depending on context, of course, but I think there is a risk that we continue working on these agendas in silos. I think there is quite a significant risk that climate policy is developed without taking the development or the justice aspects into consideration enough. And there was also a tendency, at least when the SDG framework was developed, that countries could sort of pick and choose which goals to work on, instead of seeing the agenda as something that is actually, it's a whole agenda where you need to work on all the goals in order to move ahead on each of them. So that need for coordination would be my first point. Then, of course, the implementation and actually moving towards the targets means that many different actors need to get engaged. It's not just government that is going to fix it for us. I represent a civil society organization, or we both do, and as such we of course have an important role to play, both in terms of asking for accountability on these goals, saying this is what we've promised, or you as governments have promised, now we want to see action, and we can also of course present solutions that we think should be implemented. And as a development organization, of course, we support other organizations to do the same in their countries. But there needs to be understanding and action on these issues from across society, so including the private sector and academia, financial sector, etc.
Just to add a little bit to what you already said, Anna. Of course, these global agreements needs to boil down to national implementation, radical national implementation. And in Sweden, of course, we have the climate framework, and so Klimatramverket, and also the climate goal. And even though we regard the goal as too weak, we still think it's very important to try in Sweden to push for the implementation of what the parliamentarian parties already decided upon, the climate goal and the climate framework. So I think nationally you really need to watchdog the policy and the politics, and you also of course need to work with the private sector, who are also very interested in trying to contribute, but you also need to watchdog them, I think, to avoid greenwash. An aspect that I know you are keen on, Anna, but didn't mention, is financing. And financing, of course, everything from supporting weaker groups and countries that cannot sort of pay for their own engagement in both climate and biodiversity, but also looking into the financing system that Sweden is part of. And this goes with everything from our own investments in different development banks, our pension systems, our export credits, etc. So the finance sector can become a very important vehicle towards sustainability, towards achieving these goals, but can also be a force that is driving us straight towards the cliff. So this is a very important part to follow closely also, I think.
Karin, I want to put you in the spotlight again. Can you highlight for us some examples, best practices for how your organization keeps politicians accountable, how your organization is really instrumental in the implementation?
So if I would pick climate, so we work very much with some different tools. For us, facts and information is really very important. We very often work, and that's not sort of something very new, but we use it. We work on reports that we put forward with very clear political suggestions that would be sort of the politician would be able to almost enhance. And we can see in the climate, for instance, reduktionsplikt. I don't know the English name of it, meaning that you have to mix the petrol with some biofuel. That is actually one of the ideas that came from my organization originally, that we've been pushing for like 10 years. Right now we are working on writing reports, advocating a lot for getting rid of subsidies on fossil subsidies in Sweden. We just launched a report on export credits and showcasing that for instance Swedish export credits are given for a project in Russian Arctic. What is that in English? Arctic, the Russian Arctic, which is really amazing. So we're trying to both spread light on what is happening and also trying to push the politicians to change their policy. Of course, we also do campaigning on social media, and we are discussing how we, as this big organization with a local presence, could really contribute more to the discussion on transition. So we are preparing for a bigger movement on that.
Very exciting. And if I can turn the same question over to you, Anna, for me, what's really interesting about Diakonia is that you are a faith-based organization and you are also a network-based organization. So can you talk a little bit about how you can mobilize faith-based communities, networks that maybe are not traditionally within the climate space and so on, to get them on board in climate action?
I'll take a couple of examples in general first on how we work to address or work with these interlinked issues, and also address what you just said about mobilizing congregation and congregation members, etc. We are an organization that work in Sweden with political advocacy, but we are maybe first and foremost an organization that supports civil society in other countries, in Africa, Latin America, Asia and Middle East, to work for justice and democracy and sustainability in their national contexts. So I'll take an example from each of these sides of our work, so to say. I have over the past couple of years worked with colleagues and partner organizations in 7 different countries where we have offices, on increasing the partner organizations' capacity on climate change and sustainability, how the issues are linked, how they can work, how they can learn from each other, and how to increase resilience among communities that they work with, but also to increase their understanding of the global policy frameworks and how they play out in the national context. And what we want to achieve with that is to empower these organizations to bring their experience of working with people on the ground, so to say, with local communities who are indeed affected by climate change, and bring their experiences and perspectives and needs into the national policy processes. Since the nationally determined contributions, the NDCs or climate plans that we mentioned in the presentations, that were presented in Paris at the Paris climate meeting, are going to be revised in 2020. Now I have to speak even louder to pass through the clock. They will be revised in 2020. So we are working to enable these organizations to influence that process in their national context, because these agendas need to be put into action in every country, right? And it's not going to happen, I think, in certain contexts if there is not an active civil society that really takes action and demands accountability and action on these agendas. So that's one way that we are working. And we do that work not only through faith-based groups. We are a faith-based organization, but we support organizations and groups. Thank you. Did you hear what I said while I was chiming? Yeah, okay, good. We support organizations and groups that are both religious and non-religious, so it doesn't really matter. But we work a lot with mobilization and organizing. In the Swedish context, we have, through the work we do at head office, we've followed the issue of gender in the UNFCCC process. That's the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, under which the Paris Agreement is agreed. And in the 3 years since the Paris Agreement was formed, parties have been working on formulating the Rulebook and how to implement the agreement. And a action plan on gender equality was adopted 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago. And we provided some input to the development of that plan through dialogue with the Swedish government, and have since also been in dialogue to ensure that Sweden continues to push for these issues within the UNFCCC agenda and has a well-developed strategy for forwarding gender issues. I mean, there is now a platform and a negotiation stream, and it's not actual negotiations, but it's on the agenda, you could say, in the UNFCCC. But to ensure action on gender equality and climate policy, there really needs to be champions, countries and other actors that push for this agenda. So those are two examples. And then, of course, in relation to what you asked, we do also work to some extent with mobilizing our members of congregations that support Diakonia. We did that in the run-up to the Paris conference in 2015 mainly. We had a big campaign called Act Now for Climate Justice, which was part of a global campaign undertaken by the ACT Alliance, which is an international network that we are part of, Action of Churches Together. And together we collected something like 3 million signatures globally, not in Sweden. I think we got about 30,000. To support a strong and ambitious Paris Agreement. And that really involved spreading information, raising awareness, and mobilizing people to talk about climate issues and get engaged.
To bring it down even further, sort of down to the individual level and our individual responsibility in helping to contribute to climate action. In what ways do you think you can convince the average Swedish citizen, or really citizen of any country around the world, that their actions somehow are linked to something as lofty as the Sustainable Development Goals, the global agendas? How do we connect the individual to these global goals?
Should I go first?
Sure, please.
A lot of things that can be said to that question. I think to start with, I think it's important to be able to see that, of course, we as individuals do have a role, but at the same time it's also very important not to put too much of a burden on the individual, but to really see that when it comes to these huge challenges, these are system faults that needs to be corrected. So I think it's important that you as a person can feel that it doesn't matter what I do, I can play a role. But I would say then that it's important both what you are doing in terms of your consumption, but also how you're trying to influence politics or companies or investments in terms of pension funds, etc. So from our organization, we are trying perhaps to push more for engaging in order to try to change the system than trying to be very moralistic around how much meat you eat, for instance, even though we in our advocacy are advocating for the need to reduce, for instance, consumption of meat, etc. I think it's really important to see that civil society and citizens can become a very important force. And I think the last elections where you could see that the Greens were growing in many of the countries in the EU. I think it was in 10 countries that the Greens, as a measure on environmental, I mean, I'm not sort of trying to support just one party, but this is a kind of a trend that in 10 EU countries, the Greens grow compared to the last election. And I do believe that the Friday for Future and the Greta Thunberg movement has played a role. And I can see, for instance, my now 24-year-old daughter lives in Chile for an exchange. And she sent me photos from her marching in Santiago on a Fridays for Future. I think that these kind of manifestations do play a role and has played a role in sort of pushing for the agenda. What is important now is really to keep on going and not give up. And I think my organization takes on a responsibility to try to see how can we perform a platform for long-term work that keep on over time, because it's a risk that you're trying to engage in something and nothing happens quickly enough or doesn't happen quickly enough. And then you need to have something that still gives hope, that makes you believe that things can change. And I actually think that you need to go back in history and look into other greater movements that did play a role, that did take time, it took a lot of sufferings, but it worked. Problem here is we have very little time. So I think really to try to encourage each and every one of us to become a force, not only what we do in our private life, but also what we're trying to push for in trying to change a system that needs to be changed very quickly.
Yeah, I would have, you said it perfectly well, I think, Karin. I think individual action should not be underestimated or disregarded as unnecessary, definitely not. But what is required is the political and systemic changes that you have already described. And I think that an understanding of how your individual actions in terms of consumption, etc., they can serve as an entry point to understanding the bigger picture, and therefore they are important. And also a lot of people changing their consumption patterns, their diets, etc., is a signal. It's a political signal when a big enough number of people do it to show that this is the kind of change we want, and this is what we're prepared to do. But it is not the action as such that is going to change the world, because it is the systems and the laws and etc. that need to change. So I fully agree with you.
Okay. And just to contribute an example from my side, from SIWI side, we recently started having a cross-organization conversation on reducing our carbon footprint. And we did an analysis to find that most of our contribution to emissions comes from our overseas travel by taking flights. And so we started just talking about encouraging, kind of introducing a policy at the organization to encourage more train travel. I, together with my colleague Christina in the audience, will be traveling to Bonn, Germany on train. You're right that Interrail is not making it easy. It's a lot of different trains and buses and connections, but even these small steps that we can make to reduce emissions and to strengthen our commitment to climate action, I think this is the very least we can do. So on that note, I want to leave ample time for questions from the audience. We have about 15 minutes. So if you have any burning questions, please raise your hand. A microphone will come to you, and make sure you speak loudly into the microphone.
Hi. It's something. Hello. Hello. Okay. 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 I want to refer to the Greta Thunberg phenomena. She's a pretty young woman that stands on the climate, and he strikes, and she represents civil society effort. What is Parliament doing in response of that?
Did everyone hear the question in the audience? No. So the question was about Greta Thunberg and what the Swedish Parliament is doing in response to her activism.
Should I go first? I think it's a very good question. I think at best it pushes them to at least stay on their toes. But for instance, we know that I was talking before about the climate framework, klimatramverket here in Sweden. There was 2 reports coming out in February, one from the Swedish EPA, Naturvårdsverket, one from the Swedish Klimatpolitiska rådet, the climate, well, whatever in English, climate political advisory board. And both of these reports showed clearly that we are far from meeting our own targets here in Sweden. And we know that there are now negotiations going on amongst the 4 parties that are under the January agreement in order to come forward with an agreement on how to create the next climate steps, klimathandlingsplanen. Do you know what that is in English, Anna? Climate action.
I would say the climate action plan.
The climate action plan.
Yeah.
I really need to brush up my English. This is embarrassing. Anyway, and they are struggling. They really need to come up with something radical. So I think I personally, as much as I think that Greta and the Fridays for Future are important, at the same time, I sometimes feel that they are a little bit like mascots that you refer to. It's nice and cute, but I still wait for the real sort of the real results coming out of what they say. I don't see it yet. I hope it helps to push. I think it helped to push elections in the European Parliament elections. But so far we haven't seen much on delivery to what they say when they talk about this. I'm sorry, taking...
No, it's okay. Thank you.
Yes, the lady in the back.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Lovisa. I'm working at Accenture. We talked a lot about the role of the financial institutions and what an importance they can have. And Anna, you also referenced the finance flows that actually goes in towards reducing CO2 emissions. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what you've seen with regards to, for example, the blue economy, so sustainable fisheries, shipping, tourism, and also relating to biodiversity.
Well,
Okay, I'll go first. Without being an expert on the blue economy, I think, I mean, we sometimes talk about the green economy, having, well, greening the economy, having green energy, etc. The blue economy being based on resources, I think, from oceans and coastal areas. And I mean, as for, I think, for economy in general, what needs to be put center stage is the needs that it's providing for, and the needs that it's supposed to meet. I think there needs to be more transparency and openness and wider participation in the economy, less sort of what am I trying to say? I think with concepts like the blue economy, for example, there is a risk that it's captured by those that already have the capital, who then sort of enter into that sector, and then suddenly it's green or blue because it's based on natural resources. And of course, developing coastal economies is really important, because you have a lot of people today dependent on small-scale fisheries, for example, who have, if those fishing opportunities disappear for different reasons, climate change or overfishing, are in very difficult situations, and the economy of that area needs to be developed. But if that does not build from the local assets and the local needs, I think there is a risk that you still sort of undermine a development which is sustainable and includes everybody. So a broader participation and control over how the economy is developed. Would you like to add?
No, I forgot to say before that we also have a lot of cooperation with partners overseas. So we work in 10 countries with 40 plus different partners, and also they report that there are problems in getting invited to meetings, in being included, that there's a risk that this blue economy turns into a very narrow-minded, ordinary business as usual economic growth thing, that also would risk of sort of cease mining and these kind of things. So I think the original idea with looking into resources from the sort of blue sector, there were some good things in it, but we are discussing within my own organization how to sort of relate to the blue economy concept currently, if it's possible to really be part of it and try to push for more sustainability and more sort of small-scale fishery communities participation, or where it stands now. So, yeah, I wish I was more positive than what I am currently, depending on what I see.
Any other questions? I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions. Yes. And then
There was one.
okay. Maybe we'll go with the...
So I have a different. My name is Bridget Zackerson. I have a different question. You often blame airplanes and cows. How come you don't mention wars or the boats or other effects of the climate change? It could be even worse, or even motor car racing, the sports with motor cars, driving around in nature and hurting roads and nature and people around. I think you've forgotten that in your argumentation of what's to blame.
So if I understood the question correctly, you asked about the role of conflicts or wars on climate, as well as other types of transportation or activities such as motor racing.
Yeah,
and
why
so on.
it's not blamed as much as cows and airplanes.
Would you like to take a stab at that?
Yeah, we should.
I would say we actually don't blame either cows or planes. First of all, what we say is that emissions from airplanes and also unsustainable consumption of meat is something that is important to look into when you want to combat climate change. My organization says it's really important with cows actually grazing and that we need to keep our landscapes open. I think the reason why we are focusing on emissions from airplanes and also from unsustainable consumption of meat is that when you look into figures, these are important factors. But of course I agree with you that we should also mention issues around wars and because that is of course a completely waste of resources.
Yeah, I can just confirm. I would say, I mean, the reason that the debate focuses on transport industry, agriculture, where cows and planes are aspects, is because these are the biggest emitting sectors. Then, of course, shipping, like you mentioned, is part of that, and there are discussions going on how to reduce emissions from shipping as well. But I think also the reason is not just that they are the biggest sectors, but transport and food and diets is something which it's close to everybody. It's something that we can all relate to, that we all depend on, that we have an understanding of what it's all about. And yes, while I understand where you're coming from when you talk about motorsports, it's still it doesn't involve that many people. So I think that's why messaging is often about that which relates to more people.
Mm. All right, we had a question from, yes. Go ahead. He's in a pink shirt.
Yes, so my name is Marcus, and I am a student of political science at Lund University. And I think that we all hear a lot about like sustainability and things like that in just the common discussion, and as you've had here today. But I think it's quite hard for people to really understand what that actually means and what kind of solutions there are. So I'm wondering, like, what kind of solutions do your organizations propose that we can implement today to be a part of the overall climate change solutions, such as, I don't know, iron fertilization of the oceans or something kind of concrete that people can understand? Thank you.
If I can start with something that immediately came to mind, Marcus, we do have something called the World Water Week that SIWI hosts in August. It's coming up very soon. We do invite young professionals to attend as well, and I think for me that's the best example for how citizens can get plugged into really a lot of different kinds of conversations around solutions and best practices from all around the world that are featured at this kind of festival of ideas in Stockholm. One of just a small example, one of the speakers that we featured last year, he was a young professional from Nepal who invented a way to use river flows to pump. It's a river water pump for irrigation. So I thought that was a really neat example of how these local solutions exist, and many people with the brain power to invent these solutions. And it's a great way to hear about these kinds of examples if you come to Stockholm Water Week.
Okay. I think Karin will be even more concrete than I will, but okay, the solutions that we promote are practical in the work that we do in other countries, not so much in Sweden. In Sweden we work on policy, so we promote such things as tax justice, ensuring that companies, multinational companies, are transparent with how much they earn in each country and pay taxes in each country, that businesses follow principles on human rights that exist under the UN, for example, that rich countries provide climate finance to poorer countries, and several other things. In the countries where we work with local communities, they could tell you a number of different strategies to adapt to a changing climate in agriculture, for example, water harvesting techniques, small-scale decentralized solar power systems, etc., etc. But that maybe doesn't help to explain to a Swedish public what sustainable development is, because it's quite far from the local context. But so it always needs to be contextualized, I think.
I agree with you that sustainability is a very fluffy word. In fact, so we very seldom, when we have our info sharing, talk about sustainability as one word. We very often talk about climate issues and climate measures, and of course it depends on what level you're working on. If you are a local group, you might work on everything from eco-labeling campaigns to biking, mapping, and advocating for another infrastructure in your own city. We have local groups that are working on forests well, etc., changing close days, etc. We have our own eco-labeling system that also is sort of labeling sustainable electricity, for instance, with renewables. On the national level, we have a lot of different issues that we are working for, and they are pretty concrete. They are, as I said before, they are political issues that we would like to see integrated in laws, etc. We also have our own lawyers that are pushing for one thing that we are working on. One example to wind up with is there's a big refinery in on the west coast called Preem that are already emitting a lot of CO2, and they have applied for almost doubling their work and their activities, and because they are part of the EU trading system, the Swedish system really haven't before allowed the government to say no, or the court to say no to their requests. But we have our lawyers, my organization's lawyers has put to court that we think, thinking of the climate law, that this needs to be overlooked, and we are fighting in court for getting our voice being heard and to actually question their request for expanding. So this is a very concrete case that we are working on, and next Monday, it's been postponed for several times now, but next Monday we will know if we will be able to be part in juridical negotiation on if they are going to be able to expand their activities or not. So that is perhaps one very concrete example of what we are doing.
That's all the time we have for questions. I just wanted to, actually that's a great question that reminded me that we at Swedish Water House tomorrow have a really wonderful discussion coming up on the topic of monetizing sustainability in the fashion and textile industry. It has to do with our multi-stakeholder approach involving private sector companies to talk with us, generate solutions on sustainability. And so it should be a really fascinating discussion. I think companies that you probably are well aware of, you know, including H&M and so on, they will be part of it. So I would really encourage you to come visit us at SIWI tomorrow. It's at 2 o'clock. And then finally, I want to thank once again our partners for co-convening this seminar, ABF, FUF, and Diakonia. And a big thanks to my co-panelists today. Thank you very much.